All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started here in about 3 minutes. We're going to give people a chance to join, and then we will get going.
Now is a good time to refill this coffee in the 8:30 session, and I'm only partway through my first cup. Oh, that's cool. I see the like thumbs up going across the screen. I feel like I should be a Twitch streamer. That's what I feel like. Yeah, looks like we're getting pretty good attendance here. 27 attendees. Oh, we lost one. Now we're down to 26. Oh, there we go. Back to 27. $29. Can we do 30? I see 29. Can we break 30?
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for Ednetics, one of our amazing sponsor, Matt Baird, is joining us to present topics to you. I'm Jennifer Klauser from the ACPE board, welcoming you, and I'd like to go ahead and let Matt get started.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I feel like I need some sort of like streamers or confetti going on because we just broke 30 attendees. So I don't know what the limit is on this thing, but happy to test it out. And the little emoji things are so cool. Well, thanks everybody for taking the time this morning. We've got, it looks like until about 9:45. So the presentation I have here, some of you may have seen already, is around Gemini, which is our solution for bridging the digital divide, as the title indicates. And then I've also got some information on the Emergency Connectivity Fund and the responses from the FCC on that. So through this, there's a lot of content. Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. It sounds like we can even bring you to the stage if you want to ask your question live. And I look forward to the discussion here. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going. Okay. We're starting right at the end. Okay, so I'm Matt Baird. I have taken on a role, and I assume, let's see here, I assume that everyone can see the main screen and not just the notes. So I'll flip back here, just not very familiar with this platform. So, okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Very cool. So I'm Matt Baird. I have worked with Ednetics for the last about 13 years. And through that, I've had a lot of different roles with the company. I've been a voice engineer. I've been a data center engineer. I've been a product manager for our voice solution, a director with the voice business unit. And then about 3 years ago, my family, we decided that we needed to move down to Arizona. And with that, the company said, you know what, why don't you open up an office down there? So I've been doing that for the last 3 years. And then, fast forward to the pandemic, and it was pretty interesting to me to see the similarities between the lack of connectivity or the issues that our communities were facing down here in the Southwest that were exactly the same as what was going on in rural Oregon and urban, Seattle area, along with LA County. So all across the West, I saw this exact same issue. And what Ednetics and Yakima School District had been working on was a solution to provide for connectivity to students that wouldn't otherwise have access to the internet. And so they even started on that before the pandemic, with Andy Gonzalez from Yakima School District. And that's, I'm kind of jumping through the story here, but this is really the genesis of Gemini. And what Gemini is our community access framework to address these things that we see here on the slide. So I try to cover the different terms that I've heard throughout, government and legislation. So I've heard digital divide, digital inequity, the homework gap. I've heard of digital equity. I've heard of connection light. I'm sure there is some others out there. So feel free to put them into the chat. I try to, make it as common, so if you see one of these words throughout the presentation, everybody has a common understanding of what it is. So Gemini came from that discussion between Sean Swamby, our CEO, and Andy Gonzalez. And Andy had been working with students around the lunch table, like I mentioned, even before the pandemic, to sit down with kids and find out what he could do with technology to help keep it relevant for their lives. I've noticed with my kids, the things that they use technology for are certainly a lot different than what I did. And what he found was that a very high proportion of the kids he was talking to didn't have access to internet at home. They may have had access to the internet to do schoolwork, like if mom and dad were home and they could put their phone into hotspot mode. But if mom and dad were at work, kids would have to go, like maybe walk over to McDonald's or something like that to join their guest wireless. And while that might have been fine at certain times of the day, not at all times of the day, of course. So Andy asked to work on something that would be connectivity across the broader community base, and that turned into Gemini. So Gemini is more than just a framework. Well, it is a framework, so it's more than just private LTE. Private LTE is what we're going to talk about mostly this morning, but it's really that ability to provide access to the community, to members that wouldn't otherwise have reliable access to broadband internet. So phase one for this experiment, and we're talking about Yakima School District, of course, but if this is, this could be a county, this could be a city, city facility or organization, it could be a library district. It's really, the use case is the same, really, no matter what the entity is. So phase one for this is using these, I think there's 12 orange dots here on this map, and these represent phase one Yakima School District facilities. And these facilities here have a radio mast to transmit a private LTE or CBRS signal out into the community, and then that gets received by a little hotspot device and transmitted as wireless. So I have a slide later on that will help to kind of break that down a little bit more. But each of these little quarter circles here is indicating an antenna on the school broadcasting into a certain direction. So we use this tool, this mapping tool, through Google, and that takes into account the terrain of the surrounding area, the foliage of the trees, building construction, to give you a pretty good idea of what the coverage overlay looks like for a community. So within this, the green here, this represents signal strength strong enough to get into through at least one wall of a structure, and purple would be connectivity of, say, front porch, backyard, something like that, but maybe not strong enough to penetrate the building. And so it still meets the goals for what Andy was looking for, was to provide access to the network or to the internet in a safe space. So it didn't have to be in the kid's home. It could be from the front porch, from the backyard, from a friend's house, from a community center. And then you'll see that there are some, gaps in some holes here. And one of the things that's really, I think, amazing about Gemini is it provides for collaborative network throughout the community, and we'll step into that. So I'm going to pause real quick here, and I'm just going to jump back and see, do we have any questions or comments from anybody? Maybe I haven't done enough content yet. Oh boy, 52 people. That's awesome. Okay.
Yep, no questions yet.
Okay. So I mentioned the network, and I've mentioned the internet. So what does that mean? So this would represent one of those orange dots, a radio mast on top of that building. And you can think of private LTE as really scaled down LTE service like you would from a carrier. However, with private LTE, it's connecting your network and broadcasting it out on that CBRS frequency. So I mentioned CBRS. That's the same phrase as, I think it's band 48. You might have heard of private LTE. There's private cellular network. There's a lot of terms that all kind of represent and mean the same thing. So this radio mast that's on the building connects into the school, the library, the city, whatever the network method is, and then connects that student via their little hotspot device to whatever resources they would have as if they were on campus, sitting out in the lunchroom on their, wireless or whatever. They have access to all the resources. They can, if they're using the, Zoom rooms or Zoom remote learning, they're able to interact with their classroom. And I think one of the most important things is for their outbound path to the internet still goes through the same content filter and firewall as if they were in building on district. And I think that's really important, especially as we get further into talking about the Emergency Connectivity Fund. They foot stomped that really hard about funding needing to be SEPA compliant. So in this solution, it absolutely is, because it's the same access as if the student was on premise. So I'm going to show a little bit of spoilers here on what does it look like when there's more than one organization doing this service. So this here, the orange could represent, we'll say this is the school district. The green is, say, the library. So throughout the map that I showed of the dots and the coverage overlay, I'll show that here. This could even be a split. So if we just pretended that, say, the north half of Knoll, is it Nob Hill Boulevard here? The north half here is the school district. The southern half is the city, okay? So that's the pretend land that we're in right now. And so the ones that were south of that are actually green. Well, what happens in the Gemini framework, in the Gemini network, everyone still is able to use the same nodes for connectivity, those towers on their buildings. But if I'm a green customer, what I do is I connect to that school's radio tower, but I actually have my traffic tunneled back to my school network. So the little box here is really like pretend facility. So the product or the device that makes that happen is the Gemini Gateway. So the service is built for access to a member's network. The access to that network happens through the gateway. That's the connectivity in, but we can plug some of those holes for connectivity via someone that only is interested in providing space on their building, power to power a radio, and an internet connection. And what happens in that case, I'm jumping ahead here, it looks to something like this. Now I'm a sponsor, but my user traffic transits their internet link, but it's actually in a secured tunnel through the Gemini cloud and gets me to whatever destination I'm going to. And because this is, for the example that we're talking about right now is CBRS, which is similar, scaled down cellular network, it's secured by a SIM card. And the SIM card is really the key for the destination traffic. And of course, that can also have credentials to log in to make sure that I have the ability to connect to the school's network as I should. So now the scenario that we've built here is we've built the school district buildings that are north of that Nob Hill Road. I'm a library district that's south of that road. And anywhere where I can connect to the CBRS signal for Gemini, I am going to be able to route my users back to their appropriate network and then go out to the internet using the content filtering and firewall rules that I would have as if I were on campus. And now this one new scenario that we built here is a sponsor. And so a sponsor is anyone who would be interested in providing, it even says it right here, providing bandwidth, space on their facility to support connectivity. So it provides for a community to really band together to address this problem. It could be like a coffee shop is one of the examples that I talk about. It could be a community center, a church, really anybody who is interested. And they don't have to, it's not a significant footprint for the towers. The towers are non-penetrating, so they're freestanding on the roof. They have very heavy weights that sit on them that are wind loaded to like over 100 miles an hour for wind load. So what we're not talking about something that's a heavy lift for somebody to be able to participate, and that's by design. And then as far as member organizations, these are the ones where we're really trying to get users back to their network for whatever network resources they need. So now I'm going to back up to what Yakima looks like when we kind of put this story all together here. So this would be Yakima, all of their buildings spread out throughout the district. I think there's 22 total here. And again, we can see there's going to be some gaps in coverage overlay. But then when we bring in some of those other sponsor agencies, sponsors or other members, we're really covering, 80+% of the city is the overlay. So orange dots here represent Yakima School District facilities. Green dots are something else. They could be another member. I think in this case, they're sponsor agencies to kind of help to fill those gaps. And for them, again, it's bandwidth, space on their facility, and the traffic doesn't actually touch their network. It just tunnels right through. So if there's any questions around security or, opening holes or vulnerabilities, that's not the case for this. Okay, so the main points of this is it's kind of tough for me to figure out the best way to present this, but private LTE or CBRS, that's not unique to Ednetics. The thing that's unique to Ednetics and what we're doing here is we're trying to make a complex solution simple, affordable, and digestible. So the three main components with Gemini are these here. The cloud, which is the interconnectivity between your network and the CBRS network. The gateway is what securely gets you into your building. And then access is the endpoint or the way that a user is interacting with the service. So we've talked about private LTE, but it's more than that. It could be outdoor wireless that's tunneled back to your facility. It could be a point to multi-point technology, like some areas of the country have, wireless type of high broadband or high speed wireless internet access. So really it's a framework for lighting up a community to have access. And now I'm going to go ahead.
Hey, we have a couple of questions. And I'm wondering if it will either be now or later. One of our questions is, how would you recruit institutions into the network? Do you have strategies around that?
That's a great question. So one of the things I've been doing in using, say, this sort of experiment here would be, here's my coverage of if I do this by myself. And then I look in here, I zoom in through this mapping tool, and we look for other prime locations that, again, they could be other state and local government type agencies or a building. And then I build another map that shows here's what it looks like if we work together. So in this example here of Yakima, this I didn't put in the overlay of what it shows coverage without those sponsor organizations, but you can see it's pretty compelling. It's pretty drastic. And so what happens is that the devices could be procured by the school district, or they could be procured by that other entity. And so what it builds is I think, a pretty compelling goodwill story for a community banding together. I foresee stuff like this hitting the newspaper for that other agency. It's good marketing and PR for how they're actually working to address this problem, rather than, having a stake in the ground saying no, no, thank you. Um, yeah, so that is my strategy right now, and that's gonna I think evolve as time goes on. But for the current time being, that's been very effective.
So there's several other questions in the Q&A, and depending on how you'd like to handle it, what is the anticipated cost to stand up a single antenna site?
Sure.
I don't know if we have a feel for that.
So it is on WSIPSI state contract, and I believe that is publicly available for anyone to look at. So the cost, I will say, it varies depending on the coverage area and the topology. Is that the right word? Yeah, topology of the terrain. So if it's say a city or a county that has a lot of elevation changes throughout, it's line of sight technology with private LTE. And that's one of the reasons why we look at Gemini being a framework for private LTE may not be the solution that fits all of the needs. So maybe it's a mix of different things. So a tower itself on the WSIPSI contract, I think, is about $10,000, but the service itself is split into different costs. So there are assets that are one-time purchase that you own throughout the life of the service, and the other is the licensing. The licensing is what gets you the connectivity through the network, and also ties with the maintenance and support of the service. So those costs are bundled into, we have 3 and 5 year options to front load those to pay for service, up through the next 5 years. And then I ran the math on one of the customers that we're working with in Western Washington, and their service costs for the ongoing month to month, service after that was, say, $3,000 per month for I think they may have had eight or 9 towers. Comparing that to the $30,000 per month that they're paying for their hotspots, that is definitely more digestible. Along with, right now, there are a lot of funding sources available to pay for this using the ESSER funds, the CARES money. So there are stimulus funds available today that can be used to help address this, along with additional funds that are coming aimed at the local government and like broadband access. So my goal with this service is for anybody that's interested, we can build these maps for your community, and then you have some context to the list of fees for what it costs to then, take to purchasing and see, where this could help and secure funding. I feel like for those that are interested, if you have a well-developed plan, what it's going to do, how much it costs, that should make those funds more accessible to that project.
Great. There are several other questions, but I'm wondering if we should probably complete the technology overview, and then we could dig into all of these really great questions coming up.
Oh boy, that's awesome. This is what's so fun about this discussion is it feels very relevant to today, and it generates so much dialogue. It's after 2020, not very many people wanted to talk to me in 2020. So 2021 has been a lot more fun. Okay. So I want to compare and contrast right now the Gemini portfolio compared to, this is a slide I stole from Cradlepoint. I assume that I'm still sharing my screen. Okay, so here's the Adnetics portfolio for providing access. Here is what the architecture looks like for someone to do private LTE on their own. And so I'm not saying that, someone shouldn't do it on their own. There are cases where somebody wants to run and own the service and maintain it, and absolutely, more power to you and go for it. But what I felt like with this is this to me illustrates the complexity and the parts and pieces around it. And if I'm trying to develop a plan that I'm going to access these stimulus funds to address the problem that I have of the digital inequity thing, there's a lot more to navigate through, and know that I'm doing it, in a well designed and thought out manner. So within private LTE service, there's a SAS, there's an EPC core. Between one of the two of these, one is for the SIM cards, the other talks to the FCC for, like digitally talks to the FCC for spectrum interference and power that I can transmit and the time that I can. The small cell technology would be the broadcasting radio part. And then here we're into the user endpoints that would be the kids' devices or the devices that the patrons would have at home or in their backpacks to connect to the service. So the beauty to me of Gemini is being able to package all of that complexity into really just a few line items on a budget, and everything under the hood can kind of be taken for granted because it's part of the service that we run and maintain. We have portals for being able to add additional users onto the service. And like I mentioned, it is front loaded for prepaid terms to take advantage of the funds that are available today. Okay, and so I've talked a lot about that. So why is Adnetics into this? I mentioned a little bit about my background, but I think the key is that Adnetics, we have experience in being a service provider. And so that, if you understand how to provide service and how to work with the FCC and to be a CLEC, layering in the technology, making sure that you have the right people and the right complementary products, that's what I feel like kind of helps to separate us a little bit from it. So again, we talk for free. We're happy to engage with you as a district and build out a plan. I've been talking about it as kind of like building the story for how are we going to help the community get connected and address this issue. So the next part I have is going into funding sources. So maybe this would be a good break to make sure we've covered some of the technology aspect.
Yeah, so there's several questions in the Q&A. Some of the questions surround let's see, we've got the cost. What's the typical broadcast range? Realizing there's variables involved, but and also related to that, what are the LTE bands being used, or is it, what's the majority of support for the LTE chips? What's the industry support for this plan?
Great, good questions. So the range for the service is what we're seeing. Realistic coverage would be up to about a half a mile from the tower. All things, good flat terrain with not a lot of buildings in the way. But the technology actually is more limited on the endpoint itself and being able to be heard back to the tower. So the towers will broadcast out, signal like over a mile, especially with a directional antenna that's kind of like that focused beam. But for the service to work, it has to be heard both ways. So the end device has to be able to talk back to it, and that's really the limiting factor. One of the things that I didn't mention when I had the presentation up was that Yakima School District was able to get some of our team into the houses of some of the kids, of course, with permission from everybody, and to evaluate the theoretical propagation from that tool. And it actually worked out to be even better than what shows on the map. And that's, I think, the right answer there is to be, under promising and over delivering so that the coverage map meets up with your connectivity expectations. So, you think about it in terms of probably, you know, quarter to half mile circles around those buildings is most likely what the coverage area is. But again, we can map it out to show realistically what it looks like for your community.
And is there broad support across the LTE bands? Is there, specific industry technology that you have to keep within?
Sure. Good. Another good question. So the band for CBRS, I believe, is band 48. And band 48, if you ever, I hadn't up until working with the service looked through carrier support through the fact sheet of a hotspot or something. Some of the devices that you may have already purchased for providing hotspot access may have band 48 support. Most say Apple and Android devices purchased after 2000 or produced after 2000 have band 48 support within them. So industry-wise, yes, there is. There's also been an influx of new technology developed around this. Band 48, up until about a year ago, or I guess a year and a half now, wasn't available to the public or to the masses. And so, the industry, I think, is trying to catch up. So there will be new devices, or there are new devices coming every day, but it all is already established for some of the major players. And like I mentioned, if you're ever curious about it and you look up the data sheet of a device in question, you can just read through and look for band 48. And in that case, yep, that's CBRS, private LTE. There is another band that is called EBS, which had been auctioned off a couple of years before the pandemic. The EBS was the educational broadband spectrum, or it still is, but that had been auctioned off and bought up by, I believe, T-Mobile. So broadband, or a spectrum that would have been perfect for what we are experiencing today. But not all schools have that license. So when it went up to auction, schools could choose to retain ownership of it or not. So that's another thing that we look at when we do a design, is to see, does the school have access to the EBS spectrum? If they do, the propagation is even better and further reaching. That one allows more transmitting power to get further distances. Oh, and I see I don't know how, it's my in-laws' dog that we're house sitting here. So
That's okay. That's the world we're in right now.
That's Cody.
Another technical. Yeah, how fast can a site be built out, roughly?
Right. So the thing right now that we're experiencing in basically all technology sections is inventory of equipment. There's been, I think, a worldwide shortage of silicone to produce the chips and whatnot. So shipping is 6 to 8 weeks right now on most of the equipment. But let me pull up, I have a diagram of what the tower looks like that will help with the context of that. So the towers are freestanding, non-building penetrating to help reduce the amount of like permitting or something like that that might happen. They plug into 120 volt power, and hopefully there are existing roof penetrations. There are on most buildings that we can reuse. So I'll share again. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about those freestanding masts and roofs. So implementation of these things going up is pretty quick, right? So we've got heavy blocks that go on the tower itself. This is it does get strapped down to the building. So if it does get blown over or something, it's not going to fly out into the parking lot. Yeah, about 6 to 8 weeks on the tower itself is what the lead time is. I believe it's been about 2 weeks for the radios themselves. Let's see. So we got the radios, the antennas. This is like a power board for it. What am I missing here? But stand-up time, so with Yakima School District, we're planning to have that stood up by mid-June. So that, when we ordered some more equipment just a couple of weeks ago for that. So let's call it 3 months from when you decide that you want to order to having service stood up. Of course, that's going to be availability of inventory, just like everything else with trying to buy access points or switches.
Great. Couple more technical questions, and then there's some questions around funding, so that might be a good spot for some of the funding options. One of the technical questions, you might have addressed some of this. Have you noticed any bandwidth speed issues while students are using their hotspots through this? And follow on to that would be the Gemini is an LTE proprietary system, yes or no? And do you partner with another provider, one of the other providers, T-Mobile or Verizon, for additional service options?
Sure. So it is not proprietary to Adnetics as far as private LTE. That is not, that's an industry standard, FCC standard for broadcasting service. The other part so the major carriers are also having private LTE as an offering that I've seen. What I've seen is it still has some of the data charges that go along with it. So I'm not clear yet on what the difference is between their private LTE service and their traditional hotspot service, unless, kind of the point of private LTE would be to connect you to, to own your own network or have more control of your own network. So we don't today have a bridge to the local carriers. However, we do through our manufacturer partners, say like Cradlepoint, that have traditional LTE and tunneling capability practices. That could be a part of your Gemini solution. So the main thing is that, Gemini is the community access framework. It's not tied to any particular technologies or manufacturers or companies. It's the idea of this area of my community needs access. What would be the best way for us to provide access? And on the bandwidth side, that also plays into it. CBRS has throughput of currently the service designed for, I believe it's 80 down, 20 up is what the capabilities are. That is currently limited in firmware. There's new firmware revs that come out every day to expand that. One of the devices that I'm most impressed with right now on the reception side is a 300 megabit synchronous capacity. So I think the tower technology just needs to keep catch up for it. Of course, bandwidth, just like on our cell phones, right? It's going to be signal dependent. So the stronger signal I have, the more throughput. And then we are able to tune the amount of bandwidth available on a per user basis so that not one student is able to suck up all of the bandwidth. Also, because the bandwidth is going back to the school and out to the school's internet, if there are content filtering restrictions, say to limit access to Netflix and things like that, they're not going to be sucking up bandwidth in that method.
Great. All right, we've got some funding questions, so maybe the funding options that you're aware of that would help.
Great. So back into funding. So CARES, of course, CARES is split out into multiple different. So there's underneath CARES, there's ESSER, there's GERS, there's HERS, and these are outlined into. I should have put it on one of my slides, but ESSER is really aimed at K-12. Then there's GERS, which is the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund. Both of those have verbiage in them that say that providing response to the pandemic is appropriate use of that funding. That can be providing access to students being able to connect for anything, for service, for education. it also has provisions in it for providing student safety. So these funds could also be used for, say, IP video surveillance and mass detection or congregational settings. So really think of it in terms of, am I using this money in response to something I'm dealing with because of the pandemic? If the answer is yes to that, you are have a very high likelihood that the funding for that is approved and in the spirit of the program. Most recently, we had the American Rescue Act plan put into law. That was, I think it was March 16th or March 13th when that was established. And that had $7.2 billion establishing an emergency connectivity fund. So when that first came out, for some of you that may have been on previous presentations, my understanding with that, and from talking to some of the people that had written the intent of what the service would be, it felt like it was going to be a forward-leaning program or a future funding program. And that isn't really the way that I saw it work out. So I'm going to jump into more about that. As part of the just Ednetics interaction with this, my goal is to make this a net zero to anyone's budget. So know that there are tons of funding, there's tons of stimulus buckets out there. The service fits into quite a few of them. I've talked about CARES. There's also future legislation, like I mentioned, like $100 billion coming out for broadband upgrades or broadband access to state and local government agencies. So the money is available. And we've seen that through a couple of different methods. We've had one customer that's using CARES funding or their ESSER funding to build out the infrastructure, pay the bill for it. Another one is going through, I believe it's the Washington Broadband Fund. Okay, so kind of resetting myself here. So on the Emergency Connectivity Fund that came out of that American Rescue Act plan, this is the document that I'm referencing here. And feel free to screen cap, or I can shoot maybe a link into the chat if you want to review it yourself. On my notes here, I have these sections that say like section 87, 81. That references the section within the document itself. So if you need to check up on it, I'm sure your E-rate consultants will be providing more information about it. But it was interesting to me because I was planning to help direct customers to this funding to be able to build their Gemini service. But what I see that it was really designed for is kind of a payback program, almost like a rebate program for services that you had to buy, you didn't have funding for, and now this is a bucket, or this is money to help fill that bucket back up. And then of course, once you do that, once you get your money out of the program, then you can spend it on whatever you may need. So it says in here that it's going to be prioritized if the funding all gets used up in this initial filing window. The funding will be prioritized by the current Category 1 discount. So it says maybe, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, but I have a feeling that the $7.2 billion is probably mostly allocated, even though it hasn't been requested yet. If you're not using E-rate today, it doesn't mean that you're not able to have access to this funds. That was one of the things that I thought was pretty cool. The funds are aimed at E-rate eligible entities. It's distributed through USAC, but it is not E-rate money. Their program or Congress directed USAC to distribute the funds because they figured USAC is familiar with having to distribute large amounts of money through the different filing windows. So the filing window, I have not seen it actually come out, but it's going to be a shorter one. It's going to be 45 days. And the intent of that is to see if there's any money left over from wave one. And I didn't say it, but I'm sure everybody can read it here, that the eligible expenses would be from July 1, 2020 through April 30th, a couple of days ago. Wave 2 would start on May 1st. And then again, in the spirit of making sure that they can evaluate how much money is left in the fund, they would like invoices to be submitted to make sure of you applied for the fund, make sure you're actually using the fund, pulling your money out so it's not sitting there if somebody else wants to. But the one thing that I took out of it that was interesting to me was that it requires the schools to certify that they're only requesting reimbursements for students who lacked adequate devices or service. So I know when the pandemic started, my kids both were issued Chromebooks for just bringing home and working, working remotely. The way that I'm reading this, it's saying in black and white that it's only reimbursable for those devices. I'm not an E-rate consultant, but I would recommend that you look into this and make sure that understand what you're entitled to and make sure that you're getting every dollar that's available to you. Okay, so the purpose of it is to establish off-campus connectivity for students, staff, and library patrons. So these could be, maybe there was equipment that had to be purchased for teachers and remote learning or, anybody else associated to it. So that is eligible, but it may not be used for on-campus equipment. And that is also interesting to me because I know there were some schools that were looking to add additional hotspot or outdoor wireless coverage to support kids that might not have internet at home, but provide access in a safe space. And then it is not allowed to be used for double reimbursement. So if, say, CARES funding was used for some of these purchases, it's not allowed to also get reimbursed via this program, which kind of makes sense. Double dipping probably isn't on the up and up. So when we look at devices, so devices, they're saying a portable connected device. So they explicitly said you really can't do desktops because that's not going to move around with the kid. It needs to be able to have some sort of wireless connectivity to be portable. So examples are like an iPad, a Chromebook. There's other, they list in the document itself under section 66 more of the eligible items there. And again, it's one per student for someone who wouldn't have otherwise had it. So in the example of my kids, I don't believe that those would be eligible for reimbursement. I mean, there are other computers here, but that's something that I think is worth just discussion with your E-rate consultant on. What does that actually mean? Because yes, my kids would have access to a computer, but they don't have their own computers. And then on the Wi-Fi hotspots, it's up to $250 per Wi-Fi hotspot. And then explicitly says no sparing. So some districts that I've talked to get around the data caps and overages with purchasing multiple hotspots and then trading them out with the kid as the cap was getting met. So again, reading through it, one per student, and they're expecting that the cost for that, and this came from Verizon, by the way, would be $20 per month for the LTE service. I would be interested to see that plan. I hope that our schools are able to get that good of a plan. Okay. And then I guess I have on here a couple of statements about per location, per user limitations. They say this multiple times throughout this response doc. And then the other big one is that the services have to be SEPA compliant. So and the schools are required to certify that the services that are being reimbursed were SEPA compliant. So a student had to authenticate. They weren't able to access whatever your content filtering policy is. And then wave 2, if the funding is not exhausted from wave 1, then funding will be available in wave 2. The difference here is that bids in wave 1 were not required to be competitively bid. They said that they are expecting that local procurement rules would have taken place and made things as fair as possible in the circumstances that everyone was dealing with. But for wave 2, bids would need to be competitively bid for 14 days. Again, it's an emergency fund. They want to shorten the window, but still have, I guess, some bid go out for at least 14 days. And then the one thing I think I missed on this was expected receipt of funds was within 90 days of your funding commitment, your FCDL. Okay, and that is my content for this morning. So the emergency connectivity funding, that document just came out on April 30th. So it's less than a week old to me. I'm sure there's more info in there. I encourage you to take a look. And again, just make sure, grab as much funding. Everyone had to adapt and buy things for providing, education to our kids with no additional budget at the time, with no additional funding sources. So pay yourselves back.
Great. We've gotten to many of the questions. So it sounded like E-rate was a good way to go for a lot of that for those who are looking into this. There's one other funding question, and this has come up multiple times across ACPE, the struggle between providing bandwidth for students at home and how it's interpreted by our auditors. Is it interpreted, as a gifting or personal gain from federal and state and federal funds? It would be interesting to know what the.
Yeah, so I have read from, it was, I think, out of New Mexico, there was a comment to the FCC or a petition to extend the area of education into the home, especially as our kids were going to school at home across Zoom. So that, to my knowledge, and some of, anybody else in the audience, feel free to interject, but I do not believe that has been adopted. So with this program, what we can see with the ECF funding, it's being distributed through USAC, and it is specifically calling out providing access to students at home. One that I didn't mention was it does provide for, if there is, say, a broadband connection for a student, that would be eligible for them to, say, procure an internet connection for a student at home, but it would need to be for educational use only and SEPA compliant, so that probably presents some challenges there. So to me, that shows that there is some progress in the program of allowing for connections, for allowing for homebound connections for students to connect. And I don't have a very more clear answer than that, or a better answer than that, other than crystal balling. I see Gemini as a service itself becoming E-rate eligible. I think our world has changed. The divide is not going away. We have a lot more attention to it, or I do at least, because of the pandemic. And my mission, my goal is to not let that attention slip. So I don't think I really answered the question, but
It's really tough. It has very much to do with your business manager, the auditor you're talking to, and state and local and federal regulations and interpretations therein. I invited people to raise their hand and ask additional questions, since we do have time left in our session, and I'll give a few minutes for that. There was one question about, since this is, so if I have a student device at home, and I am connecting this device through what my private network that I've built through this, is there any speed issues while students are using their hotspots through this service?
Is there any speed issues for students using their hotspots?
Yeah,
it would not be impacting the home internet, if that's a part of the question. So it's separate from the home internet. And the case of the devices, so I mentioned that the connectivity would, that green area would be expected within the home itself. We have some devices that they have external antennas, so the device could still be placed within the home, I'd have be up into the window or something like that to have better connection, and then it broadcasts out wireless, and the span of the wireless would be probably enough to even cover a couple of houses for connectivity. So even in the event where your house may not be in a prime location for coverage, likely there's going to be a way to provide service. And that's going to be limited to the signal strength that that device is able to receive in that condition.
Excellent.
But it would not impact bandwidth of the home itself.
Great. Mark Finstrom, Highline Public Schools, wants to ask a question live.
How's it going there, Jennifer? Thank you. Hey, Matt, I was just actually texting with David Roberts. He's going to be giving you my contact information so you and I can connect. But I just wanted to say, we've been looking at, PLTE, CBRS, 5G, all the different kinds of options to go down the path of building a network. We actually tied it into our last tech levy. And so this has been very informative for me in terms of just the Gemini product, because David had talked to me a little bit about it and I wasn't quite ready to hear him at the time. It just wasn't the right time. But I think you have an opportunity here with the Washington school districts to really, and Oregon too, to really make a difference in the way that we're thinking about the design and structure of our delivery. I've got a 20,000 student school district boundary, but I surround SeaTac International Airport. So it's really hard for me to put in a true LTE network because the FAA does not like to have that bandwidth crossing the flight path. And so I've been looking at the lower model. The CBRS is actually going to work most likely for us. And then, private LTE in some other areas. So I look forward to talking with you, but I wanted to make sure, not really a question, just wanted to let you know that I greatly appreciated your session and the feedback. You're a very level-headed person in the way that you communicate, and that comes across extremely well in this presentation. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I hope it comes across. I'm passionate about this service, and it gives me goosebumps talking about it because it just seems like why haven't we thought about this before? But now we're going to work on the solution.
Yep. No, you're really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. One question from Tom Howley, Director of Infrastructure Services of Renton School District. He is asking, once the system's built out, what's the potential per household cost to license and serve them? Have you run any numbers around that?
That's a good question. So that's going to be based on the density of the locations that you have, Tom. So the towers are going to cover, we'll talk about quarter, half a mile from the buildings themselves. Depending on how many users within that area need service, you're going to get a better bang for your buck on a higher density populated area versus if we're rural, farm town where there's one house per 5 or 10 acres, so it's going to be a sliding scale on that. But we absolutely could provide. So one of the things I didn't mention is that if you have hotspot locations or geolocations of where your hotspots are today, we can overlay those on the same coverage maps that we mentioned. And that helps us to really hone in on what areas of the community we ought to focus on. And then we can provide you that cost estimate per dot on the map towards the overall bill of materials there.
Great. All right. Any other questions from the audience?
So before we lose everybody, is there a way to put into the chat? I can put the link to that document that I was referencing.
Oh, absolutely. Please. And also, if you have, if that slide deck is available to share with folks, that would be excellent as well. and we will collect that and get that out in the field.
Okay.
So
Jennifer, can I send you the link? I don't see a way for me to interact with chat, but I just messaged it to you through the conference tool.
Great. We will make sure that that's available to folks. One of the questions while I grab that just popped up, do you have a ballpark that you can tell us of what the Yakima project cost was?
Oh, that is a good question. I will defer to their account manager, Dalton Bly. I saw him in the room. I'll throw that over to Dalton to see if he has a ballpark or something that he could share.
Hey everyone, can you hear me okay? Awesome, thank you. Awesome job, Matt. Just every time I get a chance to hear more about Gemini, I just think it's amazing and the work that's being done, so thank you. As far as the overall project costs for Yakima, we again use the Wasipsi state contract to base everything, and I believe the total building count, I want to say, is around 24. Does that sound right, Matt? Something like that?
It does, and Yakima is also, we were talking to Andy yesterday, is going to expand into the community as well. So we're using the school as the pilot for that, but it's going to expand into city, county, library, and it'll be a pretty massive community network.
Yeah, and if I were to just put a number on something like that, I would say budgetarily you're looking at about $175,000, for a couple of nodes, per building. Would that be fair? And that's with ideal, good the roof type that's flat and some other technical things. But I'd say the overall project is about 1.2 million or something like that, 1.3 million. Again, just we're not done finalizing some of the final phases Matt had mentioned with their community members. So it's really hard to put a final number, but we're happy to work with you, and like Matt said earlier, provide you with the information you need to take to your teams, and you'll have exact numbers at that point. So hopefully that helps.
Yep, and again, my goal is to make this a net zero to anyone's out-of-pocket budget, and after the term is over for that 5-year term, the monthly costs that we're talking about to me seem much less than the hotspot, hotspot payments that are probably going to be maintained by most districts. It sounds like it just sounds like it's a service that was useful. It's a service that's probably necessary for providing access to those. But I also feel that the just hotspot game in general through commercial cellular kind of builds upon the, what would you say, the reliance, or it possibly creates a larger problem down the road without fixing it or providing without data overage costs and things like that, and secured access to your network. So necessary service, but I think there's a better way to provide it, and that's what Gemini.
And the management capabilities, Matt, I think on the whole hotspot question, one of the major pain points that we've seen for sure is just trying to manage them, providing the content protection and filtering and everything that Matt's discussed. And it's a huge expense. We can use that, definitely redirect those funds for sure.
Excellent. Thanks, Dalton.
Thank you.
Okay, well, in closing, thanks everyone for the time and for the attendance. If you're interested in this, the root question is, do you have students or community members within your network or within your school that don't have reliable access to the internet? And if the answer is yes, we would be happy to team up with you and start building a story of what it could look like with Gemini. So feel free to reach out to me. My contact info, I believe, is listed in this, and also your local account manager. And we would love to see what a Gemini solution could look like for you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for.
All right. Thanks, everyone.